This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
We all love an open house. Mi casa es su casa. We have these age-old sayings about how we want to share our homes, but not with wildlife. We go inside outdoors with an expert in dealing with nuisance wildlife that find their way into your attic, your heat vents, and make you fear they're going to take over. Your house is their house. Raccoons, birds, bats, skunks, snakes, and more are on the uninvited list next on Kentucky Afield Radio.
That fish weighed 10 pounds.
10. That's the magic word.
Honey, I hadn't been there 10 minutes.
If he says 10, he's lying. And he says 10 a lot.
You gotta be happy you married me.
I can hear it coming.
Admit it. I'm your perfect 10.
Honey, why don't you take 10?
10-4.
Your Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife reminds you, fishing's not about math. It's about fun.
And fudge it a little if you need to.
Kentucky Fishing. Be honest.
It'll make a liar out of you.
Skipper!
They call him
Skipper!
I don't know what you mean by skipper.
Skipper? Skipper. Skipper.
Skipper! Hey, Skipper!
What? Don't skip the life jackets.
Life jackets. You're right. Thanks for the reminder.
Water officers everywhere remind you, your life jackets got your back.
And the backing of everyone that wants you to come home alive.
So Skipper, don't skip the life jackets. A public service message from your Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. This is Kentucky Afield Radio, and my name is Charlie Baglin. We take a sense of pride in opening our backyards to wildlife. We put out bird feeders, squirrel feeders, bat boxes, bird baths. Sometimes, though, wildlife takes advantage of that invitation, sneaks into our houses. But then, we're talking to Vicki Raw. She owns the business called Tri-State Wildlife Management in northern Kentucky. And, Vicki, you are a critter getter of sorts. What do you call this profession?
I try to avoid the word critter. I'm a wildlife control operator. In the name of my company, I use the word management instead of control because I don't feel like I really control animals, but I try to manage them to a tolerable level.
You are one of the people that anybody could call. You personally are in northern Kentucky, and so someone in Bardstown isn't going to be calling you. But you could probably speak well on behalf of people like you in this profession across the state, because critters are critters are critters, even though you don't call them critters.
Exactly, and you're exactly right. So somebody in Bardstown for a raccoon or a squirrel or a skunk or a groundhog, they called me, which they often do from around the state because of my presence on the web. I can refer them to somebody that I think is close. Now, if they call me for a bat job or a pigeon job or a goose job or something like that, I would travel that far. And there was even a bat job down in western Kentucky last year that was a real good one, and I just couldn't get to it. But I knew a good operator in that area that was able to take care of the problem for that person.
I'm going to presume that to be in the business that you're in, wildlife management, to manage wildlife in the sense that you do, it's not just something you wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm going to do this, or I've got the nerve to do it. A snake doesn't scare me, or a bat doesn't scare me. You have to go through some licensing and permitting and training. What is all that about?
Well, yeah, and there's a tremendous amount of permits and license and paperwork. I oftentimes think if I'd have known all of that in the beginning, I'm not sure that I would have started a business. In the state of Kentucky, we have to take a test for the state of Kentucky. Likewise, since I'm up in the northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area, and I service Ohio and Indiana as well, they have separate tests. So all of my technicians have to take that test as well. And they all have to pass the test, and we have to record every animal that we catch and then what we do with that animal once it's caught. For example, if we are going to release it, we have to have written permission from a landowner of 100 acres or more to release an animal on that property. Now, if it's sick or something like that, naturally we will not. But as far as the permits go, we have to have a permit for every city, every county, and like I said, I have to do that in Ohio and Indiana as well.
And there has to be a mountain of paperwork.
Yeah, I can't handle all the paperwork, so my office staff consists of 2 part-time individuals, that have to, take care of all of that. We have a tremendous amount of insurance. I belong to and am on the board of the National Wildlife Control Operators Association. So through that association, we have an insurance company that really takes care of us.
I've got a list here in front of me that says garages, attics, species of wildlife, at least. I'm glad to say that a raccoon doesn't come in my living room. He'll at least go in my attic, or at least he'll go in the garage, or be worrisome out on the porch. Doesn't come inside. I guess they're scared of us, but there's something about our homes that attracts wildlife. What is it?
Well, and to add to that, a chimney is another place, a special place for raccoons that they love. It's like crawling down into a holler tree, and then they have their young on top of the damper. The way I tell people and the way I look at that, most of our jobs are in a suburban or an urban environment. Most folks in the country don't have this problem. But if I were a raccoon or a squirrel or even a skunk or any animal in the city, I would much rather live in your attic than in a hole in a tree. Or if I was a skunk, I would much rather live under your porch. The porch, the dirt under the porch settles and under the sidewalk. So it's kind of like a nice cozy cave under there. The temperature stays pretty good winter and summer. So we have just created much nicer habitat than what Mother Nature already had for them, much more comfortable habitat, I should say, than what Mother Nature provided. So we're inviting them in. We're not stealing their habitat so much as just creating a more comfortable place to live.
They don't know that it's our home. They don't know. They just see it, hey, that's the perfect spot.
Well, and not only that, but once they live there, once they've established themselves, they get a fidelity to that place. They get that's their home, and they're going to fight for it. They're very, very persistent. And when I say that about all wildlife that enters a home, from a bat to a starling to a squirrel. That's home, and they think, what business is it of us to try to get them out? So if we just seal the entry hole when they're outside, they're just going to chew in or break in somewhere else. So removing the violating animal is important, as well as doing a very, very good repair job.
What kind of calls have you had to deal with what animals?
Well, it's very, very seasonal, I'll tell you that. But our three top animals are by far raccoons, squirrels, and bats. Some operators only stick with fuzzy animals, such as raccoons and squirrels, and won't do something that's a little bit more sensitive, such as bats. A lot of operators won't do birds, such as pigeons or Canada geese. We get a lot of snake calls this time of year. Skunk season starts in February, and we're still getting a lot of skunk calls. Groundhogs, we're getting the calls now. The downside to that is they're easiest to trap in February and March, but folks don't know they're under there so much, under the porch or driveway or shed in February and March, so they don't call us. We're getting a lot more flying squirrel calls than we used to get. When I was a kid growing up, I knew of flying squirrels, but then they just seem to disappear in northern Kentucky for the most part, but now we're getting a lot more flying squirrel calls. We still get calls on possums. Sometimes we get the crazy call with the cougar or the alligator or something like that, but the cougar has never really been seen, and I have pulled an alligator out of a local park because we're so close to Ohio, and they run rampant with exotic animals, so folks in Kentucky might sometimes purchase them, and then when they get too big or sick, they'll set them free.
I had a brother-in-law in Lexington who went to war with a few squirrels who were apparently had made their way into an attic of a house he owned. And he was attributing this to the fact that the people living in the home fed the squirrels. They would go out in the evening and just throw peanuts out, and the squirrels would come up. Does that sound plausible, that the squirrels would become so in love with this home and this dwelling that they would try to just move in?
Yeah, and that's absolutely the case, too. When you have a person that feeds the animals, when you have a feeder, they're doing that because they like to see the animals. They don't have the understanding that Mother Nature can sustain these animals. There's plenty of food out there for them. So what they're doing is they're throwing the peanuts out or whatever they're giving them, and it's oftentimes peanuts with squirrels. And that's drawing them closer and closer because it's easier to pick up a peanut than to go, dig your acorn up from last season. And that gets them more and more comfortable with us, and that gets them closer and more comfortable to our homes, especially in a suburban or urban environment. And yeah, once they're closer, they have less fear of us, then your house is just the next step.
Vicki, we need to take a break, and this is a good spot, but more on the subject of just how tolerant wildlife are of people and us of them, and how to draw that line. When we come back, my name is Charlie Baglin, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We are back into segment number 2 on Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. My guest is Vicky Raw. Vicky's an expert on the subject of nuisance wildlife, a skunk in the garage, for example, bats in the attic. Animals we all like, but not when they get too close for comfort. So, Vicky, how close is close?
If I walk down the sidewalk in the city, I can get within 4 feet of a squirrel. I live in the country. I can't get within 20 feet of a squirrel unless I'm very quiet and still. It's a big difference in an animal, and I'm not just talking about squirrels, in any animal. This happens with raccoons and coyotes a lot as well, where folks feed them, whether it's intentionally, like with the peanuts, or unintentionally, with a compost pile or trash cans or cat food. That does draw them in. They have less fear of us, and that house is just a really neat spot because, there's plenty of food there, and a squirrel has to continuously chew. So to chew on the house is just as easy as chewing on that tree, and to chew in, it's just very comfortable. It's just right for an animal. And I keep using squirrel, but like I said, that works tremendously well with raccoons too. Raccoons tend to learn to expect us to feed them, whether it's the cat food or the trash can or whatever it is, or just feeders throwing things out, or a bird feeder. A raccoon and many animals will just eat the seeds that have fallen and then start climbing the bird feeders as well.
Seems like a squirrel is going to take the path of least resistance. If he was going to get into an attic, there would have to be a hole there that he could squeeze in, or is he really going to chew through the wood? Is he going to chew through shingles or any flashing around chimneys? Or is the squirrel going to say, hey, this is more trouble than it's worth, I'll go out to the garage where there is already a hole in the wall? What's the psychology of a squirrel there?
To start off with what you said at first, any animal is going to take the path of least resistance, not just the squirrel, but the squirrel's teeth continue to grow. They're a lot like a rat, so they have to chew in order to keep those teeth filed down a little bit. If you're feeding them or if they're just in the neighborhood, they climb the tree, they hop on the roof, they're on every roof every day. An animal has nothing on his hands but time. All he wants to do is eat and be comfortable. They're on your roof, they have time on their hands, they have to gnaw, so they're going to start gnawing on anything they can find. But any place on that home that is at risk, that has a vulnerable spot, they're going to chew into that. That's going to be where they pick. There doesn't have to be a hole there already. They can make a hole. They'll rip shingles, like you said. Oftentimes, it's where a dormer meets a roof line or two parts of the roof line come together. Oftentimes, it's a soffit. And someplace else that they chew into frequently, too, is we have these ridge vents on the tops of the ridge of our roof, and they go most of the length of the roof, and they have end caps in them. The end cap is usually either a foam plug, or a rubber plug. Very easy to chew. And when we have a squirrel getting into an end of a ridge vent, more often than not, that metal ridge vent will be chewed as well. We use 24 gauge sheet metal to do repairs for animals, and that's why. They're going to chew aluminum and vinyl as well as wood and shingle.
I'm going to repeat that. They will chew aluminum and vinyl as well as wood.
Yeah,
I really wasn't aware of that a squirrel would be so gung-ho about getting into an attic that he's just going to chew through steel.
It's really interesting to see what a raccoon or a squirrel will do and what lengths they would go to. Oftentimes your jaw would drop and you would have to pick it up off the ground to see, for example, a raccoon easily climb up the side of a house. customers will say, well, I don't understand how he's getting up there. We don't have any trees. But then if I look at the downspout, it's covered with black soot from the raccoon using it continuously. If the downspout's moved, he'll use the cable line. If it's a brick home, he'll go right up to any corner of it. It's very, very easy for a raccoon or a squirrel to climb a house, very easy for a squirrel to chew, and very easy for a raccoon to rip. They'll chew and rip at a home, and they'll do a tremendous amount of damage. Another vulnerable area on a house is a gable and attic louver vent. That's a notorious spot for animal entry.
Sounds like the animal's going to win no matter what the homeowner does. But is there a list of suggestions you give to homeowners that say you might want to try A, B, and C, and this may ward off some of your problems?
We do that for folks all the time. Our motto is, we don't want you to have to see us again. We don't want you to have to hire us and spend your money on wildlife again. So when we go to a home or a building, any structure, we're looking for anything that's at risk, anything that's vulnerable or a sensitive area on that structure, and we can tell the folks, we can either do a little bit of a repair and preventative work, or here's what we recommend you watch out for. We'd prefer to take care of it now rather than you have to call us back later. So we'll tighten up soffits. We use a lot of screws. Like I said, we use a lot of sheet metal. We rarely repair with wood. Another vulnerable spot is your soffit vents. Oftentimes folks have that screened soffit vent. Window screen is a welcome mat for any animal, whether it's behind a gable louver vent or in a soffit. They know that that's just a matter of minutes before they can chew or push through that.
Are there many women in this business?
No, there's really not many. Oftentimes, though, what you do see, when I go to, we have a national expo every year, and you do see a lot of women there. Oftentimes, the man that's the business owner, his wife is who does the books, she does the paperwork, and many of those women go out on the jobs with the husbands. I know a lot of women across the country that are in the truck with their husband, getting on the roof as well, and sometimes into attics too. So as far as them being the business owner and starting this kind of business, that's not very typical. There may be 3 that I know of across the country. And I will tell you too, there's a friend that I have in Chicago. She only does birds. She's not the owner of the company, but they are getting into wildlife a little bit slowly because of her persistence, because of her love for it. She does Canada goose work, and she has gotten into pigeon work, and she's very interested in the wildlife aspect of it. And although she's not the owner, she is getting that owner involved. We're going to be teaching her bat work next, and then it's just a matter of time before they get into the rest of it. You
bring a lot of love for the outdoors to your job. Before we started the interview, you said you are an instructor for NASP. You've been part of the Becoming an Outdoors Woman program, part of the Kentucky Aquatic Resources Education program, teaching kids to fish. You do a lot of that sort of thing, don't you? Rattle off your interest in the outdoors.
I grew up with a father and a grandfather that were outdoorsmen. Hunting at that time in our area consisted of squirrels and rabbits. There was no deer hunting. When we saw the first deer here in northern Kentucky, it was crazy. It was a sight to behold. They weren't just hunters. They were the kind of guys that would go sit in the woods. My grandfather had 9 grandkids that would just follow him down into the woods, and he would teach us how to pick up a black snake and hold it and show us that if it does bite us, their teeth are like sandpaper. It's kind of neat. So I grew up not flinching when I would get bit by a snake. Now, if I lived in another part of Kentucky, I certainly would not recommend picking up snakes. I'm very fortunate where I live, and they taught us to identify the different snakes. I learned as an adult, I didn't realize what my father and my grandfather taught me, because when my dad would go hunting, I would be the one, not my siblings. It would just be me that would sit and watch him clean the squirrels and have to, if you smell a squirrel's feet, they smell like nuts. And I get that from my dad and my grandfather. They just had a natural love of the outdoors, and it's not just the wildlife. They would garden, and they were environmentalists as well. Just taking care of the resource. That's very important. And then when I had my children, for 3 years, we moved into a subdivision, and none of the other kids knew about wildlife, and I thought that was so tremendously odd. That's when I started learning that I had a love for teaching outdoor programs. I actually started off as a fur trapper. While I worked for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, I fur trapped as a hobby, and I thought that was very important to take my 4 kids out on the trap line and hunting and letting them know that there is a certain respect and, like you said, ethics along with it. You always want to treat the animal with a tremendous amount of respect and be good to that animal. If there is a death involved in the animal, you want it to be quickly and safely, and you want to make sure that you set your trap line safe so that it can't interfere with any domestic animal or person that could happen to come by. And I can't imagine that I could do anything else. You're just kind of in tune with how an animal thinks. And if I was a raccoon, what would I do? Or if I were a beaver, I would slide down this slide and I would go in that hole. And you just kind of have a know or a knack for what the animal's going to do. And it doesn't hurt to have a great teacher. There's my mentor is a gentleman by the name of Wendell Porter. He's a longtime retired game warden. And to have somebody like that in your life that has such a tremendous amount of knowledge and is such a woodsman, I get a lot of opportunities from Wendell Porter.
Vic, I hear music playing in the background. That means we have to take another break, but when we come back, we'll talk about how you know what you got living around your house. Sometimes you see the critter, sometimes you just see evidence of the critter, like tracks or a burrow. We'll see where it leads. Stay with us. I'm Charlie Baglin, and this is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Charlie Baglin here on Kentucky Afield Radio. You can follow us on Facebook, of course. It's a great place to give us suggestions for guests, leave your comments. Find us at Kentucky Afield Radio. Spell it all out, Kentucky Afield Radio. If you don't put radio on there, up pops the TV show, and you need to put radio on there to find us. Like us, and you'll like us. Our fishing report now. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio and more on keeping your home critter-free right after the break.
Skipper! Skipper!
I don't know what you mean by skipper.
Skipper? Skipper! Skipper!
Skipper! Hey, Skipper!
What? Don't skip the life jackets.
Life jackets. You're right. Thanks for the reminder.
Water officers everywhere remind you, your life jackets got your back.
And the backing of everyone that wants you to come home alive.
So, Skipper, don't skip the life jackets. A public service message from your Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife.
In the news, whales have been spotted in Kentucky waters. We have an expert standing by on the water's edge.
There goes the bobber. Set the hook.
Daddy, it's a whale.
Way to go, buddy.
Childlike wonder for the outdoors. It still exists. Where to go, what to take, and how to get started are waiting at the Kentucky Fish and Wildlife website, fw.ky.gov. Take a kid fishing. Don't let the opportunity get away. We are into our second half hour on Kentucky Afield Radio on the subject of nuisance wildlife. How to keep it under control yourself, and if you can't, who to call. Some of the tricks that they use. Squirrels in the attic, raccoon in the garage, or living in your basement. We're talking to an expert in the field. Her name is Vicky Raw, and her business is in Alexandria, Kentucky. That's northern Kentucky, where she serves not just Kentucky, but Ohio and Indiana.
Yeah, that's correct. When I started my company, it was Out of Control Wildlife. I thought that was a catchy name, and we started off doing more of the outdoor education than the trapping. But then as we grew, and I'm one of the few people up in this area that will service Indiana as well, I thought for the trapping or the nuisance wildlife portion of my business, it was more appropriate to call that portion Tri-State Wildlife Management so that folks could get a better idea of who I service.
You're out of Alexandria?
Yes, sir.
And the last time I was in Alexandria, still not a thriving metropolis. You have Northern Kentucky University there, and I am an alum. So I know the area where you live and work. But
right.
Then again, the tri-state area, you are still out in the country, we should say, even though you're up in Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati area.
Right.
Let me take you on a trip to my front porch. because I've often looked at this burrow that is under my front porch. I don't know what's under there. I don't know what made it. I never see anything coming and going. And I'm wondering, should I block it off? And if I do, am I going to trap something under there and kill it? Or should I? What is your advice for somebody who just sees a hole leading where a hole shouldn't lead?
Yeah, and we get that call a lot. And oftentimes it's right where the steps go into the go up and next to the porch. And sometimes it's a burrowed hole under the sidewalk even. But every day we get a call about a hole at the front porch, and the first thing I do tell them is what you alluded to: don't block it off. It could be that it's not being used at this time. More often than not, though, it is. Even if an animal made that hole and abandoned it, you have animals that are opportunists that are going to take advantage of that. So what we do is we can advise the customer, and if they don't want to get their hands dirty, we can go out and do it, is we use a wildlife indicator. And that might sound a little bit professional, but all a wildlife indicator is, in that instance, is perhaps some sticks laid over it, half an inch apart. That's not going to blow away. We'll make a wildlife indicator grid for a hole chewed in a house out of gorilla tape. And by putting a wildlife indicator up, whether it's a burrowed hole or a chewed hole in a house, that tells us the whole story. We can tell who's coming and going oftentimes, especially with the gorilla tape, and if it's being used. Our rule of thumb on most times of the year, not for the middle of winter, is if we or you put your wildlife indicator up and it stays good for 7 days, you can repair it or fill it in. Unless it's in the very cold of winter, most animals will not hole up more than 3 or 4 days, but I've had animals hole up for 6. And that's the most I've ever had them stay inside without coming out during normal temperatures. So the repair for something like that is a little bit sensitive, because if you just block it with a couple of rocks, they can get back in. More often than not, though, the indicators are disturbed. That tells the folks that they do have an animal there. Vicki needs to come and remove it.
And so that's something that they would hire you to do, or how much of this nuisance wildlife management can a homeowner do on their own and do safely?
They can do some. I'll give you some examples. If we're dealing with raccoons, I would prefer that they not try to trap the raccoons on their own. And my reason for preferring that they not do that is because if they do it wrong, they might educate that raccoon to make it much more difficult to catch once they kind of mess up on their own and then call me. For example, if you don't know how to use a cage trap properly and a raccoon gets out, if they flip it over and get out, then that raccoon is not going into a cage trap anymore. That's now considered an educated raccoon. So we would have to use other means, more difficult things to set up. So raccoons I would prefer trapping on my own. Things such as groundhogs right now, groundhogs are a little bit more difficult to catch because there's plenty of good food out there. So I might guide somebody through setting the trap themselves. If they say, hey, I already have a cage trap, can I try to do this on my own? I'll guide them through what they need to do to attempt to do it successfully. And then if they catch the animal and do not have any place to take it or anything to do with it, then we pick up animals for a fee as well that folks have caught on their own. Aside from a raccoon or a groundhog getting out of a trap and not being able to be caught again, most of the time people don't want to trap their own skunks. If you're talking about trapping animals that are in a home, it's difficult for a homeowner because they don't know how to tell if they've gotten all of the violating wildlife out.
I was at Cumberland Lake State Resort Park a few years ago, and they are known for raccoons, the raccoon population. I had the door to my hotel room open, and I looked around. There stood a raccoon, not out on the deck, but almost wanting to jump up on the bed. Fortunately, he left. I can see something similar happening at your house. Let's say you open a window. Bird flies in. a lot of people are just simply going to freak. Species of wildlife gets into your home. Is your first reaction to panic?
Well, and it depends on what the animal is. If it's a bird, for example, turn off the lights, even if it's during the daytime, turn off any lights and open the nearest window or door. And get out of that room, kind of maybe be able to watch, but get out of that room and be still. The bird's going to be just as panicked as the homeowner is, and the bird would prefer not to be there, so he really wants to go outside. Open that door or that window, keep the room calm and as dim as possible, and, that animal will leave more often than not. If it's a raccoon or something and he's in your house during the day, all that raccoon's interested in doing during the day is curling up in a ball and sleeping. So you can open the door and leave it open all day long, and chances are that thing's not going to leave. He's going to say, leave me alone, it's time to sleep, I'll think about that at dusk.
Well, should you take a stick or a broomstick and try to shoo him out of the room, or is that dangerous?
Well, each animal has its own personality. I would never recommend that a person do that. If I was to tell somebody, well, take the broom and shoo him away, and that person were to get hurt by that animal, which is possible, then I don't want to be responsible. It just seems that because I can read an animal and some people can understand an animal better, it might be kind of easy for me to do. But I would fear for that person maybe getting too close, or what if that raccoon has distemper? If a raccoon has distemper, they look all docile, and you can get very close to them, and I would hate for that raccoon to turn on that person. I wouldn't be able to recommend doing that, but I'm not saying there's some people that cannot.
You've been doing this for years now, right? How many years have you been in the business?
I think I started the business in 2005, but before that, I was just, people were calling me continuously, and I was just going and helping them out. It would be relatives and friends of friends, and then when it got to be friends of friends of friends,
right,
that's when I decided, you know what, this might be something.
What was the biggest challenge you have faced to date? What species of wildlife, maybe it's a snake or a raccoon or a bat, that generally gives you the most difficulty to remove?
A snake is sometimes hard to find. If a person found a snake in their house, unless they can keep an eye on that snake, which they would rather not do, I can't guarantee that I can comb through their house and find it, because he could get down into a register, or he could be in the attic by the time I get there. You never know. Right. So it's difficult if they don't keep an eye on it. But there's, every animal has its pros and cons. A raccoon might be a little bit more difficult because I'm carrying a heavy trap on a roof with an animal running from end to end, and then I need to go down the ladder. So the degree of difficulty varies with the animal and with the season.
To some degree, animals are allowed on our property, and we want them there. We put out bird feeders and squirrel feeders and you name it, bird baths. At what point does that animal cross the line? And let me ask you this. What animals don't really qualify as mice, for example? Do they qualify as nuisance wildlife? Is that just a pest?
That varies from state to state. In Kentucky, that's just a pest. You have to call a pest control company. But you asked a really good question, because we don't want to get rid of all of the wildlife. We want it to thrive, and we want to be able to watch it, or wildlife is wildlife, and that's part of our environment. But what we need to do is just kind of keep it in check. If we have some wildlife that is really a problem, causing damage to property or threats to persons, then that's when it needs to be managed. And sometimes that means, to some individuals, that means get that skunk out from under my porch, because I'm walking there at dawn and dusk every day when they're out, and I don't want to stumble upon it and get sprayed. So each person's tolerance is different. Once they get into a house and there's a squirrel in your attic and he's chewing on your electric lines, well, there's your sign. You really need to get that squirrel out of your house. Or if a raccoon's on your damper of your fireplace, you don't want that in your house, then you really need to get the fireplace, the damper, cleaned out as well, because their droppings are much different than, for example, squirrel droppings as far as disease and raccoon roundworm and things you can get. So it's up to the individual what they will tolerate, but then when they cross the line by getting into the attic, chewing on the wires, ripping things up, causing damage to your home, or threatening your children or pets, that's when the line is crossed.
We still have a segment to go, so stay with us. Vicki, we got to get to a break. We'll be back with one more segment on the subject of nuisance wildlife, the animals that call your home home and you don't want them to. Stay with us on Kentucky Afield Radio. We are back in our final segment on how to control wild critters that get where you don't want them to be. This is Charlie Baglan on Kentucky Afield, and we're talking about places such as your crawl space, your garage, under your porch, attic, your bedroom. Nuisance Wildlife Control operator Vicki Raw is our guest, and Vicki, let me share a personal story. On my back deck, and I live in a regular subdivision, I have had as many as 3 raccoons come up on my back deck. Cute, yes, but they seem to think that my back deck is a litter box, and that's something that nobody likes. A neighbor of mine says, well, you know, I have a trap, and you can set this trap out and catch the raccoons. I said, okay, talk me into it. So I got her trap, easy to operate, put it out on the porch at night, put a couple of cookies in there. Next thing you know, I caught a raccoon. Put it in the back of my Jeep and took it down to the local creek 4, maybe 5 miles away and set it free. And the next night, I would put the trap back out, catch another raccoon the next night. And I got to thinking, well, I want to make sure that I've got them all. Maybe there's a 4th raccoon that I just haven't seen. After all, raccoons tend to look a lot alike. And so I put it out, and you know, for a couple of nights after that, I'm still catching raccoons. What I thought was 3, I'm betting is closer to 300 that are coming throughout the night. I'm just not seeing them. Maybe 300 is an exaggeration. But nonetheless, there were certainly a bunch of raccoons that inhabit the neighborhood. So I decided maybe I shouldn't be trapping these raccoons anymore, because one of these nights I'm going to go out there, and I'm going to have caught something other than a raccoon. In fact, I'm thinking that there is a skunk out there.
Yeah, and that happens all the time. And actually, your question has 2 points to it. If you, for example, are taking your raccoons 3 miles away, some folks say 3 miles, some say 5. I say better safe than sorry, 10, because what you were probably doing was catching some of the same raccoons time after time. Now, more raccoons or wildlife will vacuum in once you trap your raccoons and take them away. But oftentimes folks don't take them far enough, and they're just catching the same raccoon time and time again. In your case, that's not a bad experience for the animal to be in that cage, because he got his belly full and then was released right away. But a lot of times people are out there to catch that possum or that raccoon and end up with the skunk, and then they call me in a panic and say, you know, what do I do? As you probably know, most people cannot approach a trap with a skunk in it and not get sprayed. In that case, the best thing is to call me, and I can get the skunk and take it out of the cage for them.
What other final words of wisdom do you have for folks that live in these wildlife-prone areas?
Number 1, don't feed the wildlife. We like seeing the animals. We like knowing that they're there. But once you start feeding them, they start feeling a little bit too comfortable with us. That's when there starts to be issues. And sometimes there's people that don't have a neighbor or are not feeding them, and they still have a wildlife problem. If your house has weak spots on it, so keeping your house tight, I mean, just a hole that a squirrel can get its chin into can enable that squirrel to start chewing. Or just something that a little raccoon can stick his finger into will get him to start picking at that. Keep your house tight. Put the wood pile stacked neatly away from the house. So oftentimes it's just the lawnmower and the 2x4s and the wheelbarrow and everything piled next to the shed. All of that kind of stuff is very attractive to an animal.
Last point. Wildlife nuisance control operators, I take it that is the proper name for what you do. If you're going to take a test to be what you are, it is a nuisance wildlife control operator. A lot of ethics and permitting comes with that. And we haven't talked about what do you do with the animal once you get it out of the home.
Studies that were done on Canada geese, for example, some states require you to only relocate and not euthanize. Well, up to 80% of those birds trying to find their way back home are dead in much more cruel ways than if they were euthanized properly, whether it's starvation, predation, hit by a car. And that's how it is with many animals. Different studies, different times a year. You don't want to go take a raccoon or a squirrel and release them in the middle of the winter with no food, no shelter. No, I'm not saying that releasing is good. Maybe sometimes it is. I would release with caution.
Vicki, let's wrap it up by asking anyone anywhere in Kentucky or any of our surrounding states, where do they go on the web? What do they look up? What do they put in Google to find you or someone like you?
Oftentimes, it's noise in my attic or smell in my chimney. Or if they think they know the species, sometimes they'll say groundhog under my shed, or skunk under my porch, or just animal. NUCOA, the National Wildlife Control Operators Association, if you go to their site, you can click on your state and find wildlife control operators that belong to NUCOA, which is the organization that tries to educate wildlife control operators.
Can you spell that?
And it stands for National Wildlife Control Operators Association. NWCOA. And then next to their name, they will indicate, for example, if they're a certified wildlife control operator, which is somebody who has gone through a much more rigorous amount of education. So the CWCP, the Certified Wildlife Control Operator, is someone that you know that has gone above and beyond and has educated themselves and their company and their staff, keep trying to know the latest and the greatest techniques to use.
The world is a better place with people like you in it. Vicki Raw, thanks a million.
Thank you. Thank you a lot. It was a pleasure.
It's been a good show. Vicki Raw, an expert in dealing with nuisance wildlife. We're about out of time, so as a final thought, let me say this. Sometimes, as homeowners, or even more so as humans who like animals, we find ourselves tugged in two different directions, either as Noah or Dr. Dolittle. We like to think of ourselves sometimes as having a special magic with animals, a unique connection. We like the raccoon bouncing across the backyard, but once he wanders up to the back door or into the attic, then we suddenly see a more conflicting side to that relationship. So the old cliche is true. A place for everything, and everything in its place. That said, don't confuse a critter with knowing theirs. At the end of the day, these animals are wild. They do what works for them and for their survival. It's up to us in our homes to be aware of just where we roll out the welcome mat. We are out of time. It's Charlie Baglin inviting you to join us in a week, and we will go inside outdoors again, right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.